All right. Welcome to the Klazar podcast, everyone. Klazar podcast is where we talk about modern GTM motions that are transforming sales and partnerships across the SaaS businesses. And we do this by inviting fantastic leaders across the industry. And today we have one such phenomenal leader with us, Pete. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Appreciate. I'm excited to be here, General.
Awesome. And Pete, you have a interesting background. When we were doing research about your background for the podcast, I realized that you were a solution architect before, an engineer, and now you're leading tech alliances and partnerships. So walk us through what that journey has been for you.
Sure. I always struggle when people call me an engineer because I actually am not a formal engineer. I was a solution architect, which back in the day we called a sales engineer. I was the guy who brought the technical value out to the business and explained it. I could make it work, but I couldn't build it. But I actually found a role doing that a long time ago after I'd been in direct sales, which had been a struggle, and just found a really good match for me. And actually love learning products, love breaking them down, love learning different industries and how people applied it. And I did that for about 15 years. And at some point in the last role I was in, Amazon found me and started recruiting me. And they actually pulled me into a business development role. And at Amazon, this is back in like 2012, business development was different there. They really wanted people with a technical background that could go talk to customers about solving problems, pay as you go, no contracts. Like it's not really selling, it's changed. But back in the original days of AWS and Amazon, it was all about self-service. And so it was a focus on that. And so I spent a couple years doing payments there, which is kind of where I came out of a security company and doing PCI solutions into one of the payment services. And it's now called Amazon Pay. Think of PayPal. And then after a couple of years of doing that, learned about the AWS Marketplace. I worked with the third-party marketplace, and I was like, oh, I can go sell software, and it was a really good fit. And so I went to figure out, and I launched the DevOps category back in, I think, early 2015, and tried to recruit and build the original sellers on that platform in that category. And it was a tough slog because we didn't have all the great stuff they have today. It was the early days. And after doing that for a couple of years, went to the partner org because I wanted to manage the bigger relationship. And I feel like AWS followed me when they merged the two of them together a couple of years ago into a single org, which makes a lot of sense, especially for the ISVs. And then 4.5, 5 years ago, I left AWS and went to GitLab where I ran their alliance. They were a partner I managed. And so I went and did the work from the other side. And earlier this year, I made the jump to own, where I'm building out the AWS relationship in the Americas.
Got it. Fantastic. And that's a good segue, Pete, into my next question, which I was curious about. Like, AWS was the first one to launch the marketplaces back in 2012, I believe. And by the time you moved in to handle ISV Enable in 2014, they had already had some notable names on the marketplaces and, a few handful of listings as well. I'm really curious, like, what did the early days of marketplace initiations look like? What did that world look like back then?
So it was definitely a different world, right? Like nobody really got it. Most software companies had big sales forces or big channel relationships and sold through the channel, for the commodity goods or the networking stuff. And then, more complicated software like I did in the DevOps category and some of the other things I've done in my background. Self-service doesn't really align. Like we build complicated technology. How do you think someone's just going to click and download it, right? And then we had technical challenges where it all had to be on a single machine image, right, on an AMI, right? And we billed hourly, and that was tough. So we had lots of things that didn't really totally make sense. But I think what I saw in the whole thing and what I thought was super exciting about it, and I feel like we're closer and closer to it now, 10 years later, is the pay-as-you-go model, right? The consumption-based model for software, right? Like we sort of made half a leap with subscriptions and SaaS, where like in a year you got to own up, or if you don't do a good job with your customer, there's a chance they can churn, right? And that's everyone's biggest fear these days. But if you provide a good product and people use it, right, they don't turn it off. They don't cancel their subscription unless they go out of business, right? And so you have to prove yourself. And I just always felt that was a better way to buy than back when we sold perpetual licenses and then these giant maintenance contracts. And customers never deployed it, and then they didn't know how to get out of it. There's just a lot of waste, and I think Marketplace was trying to remove that waste. But I don't think we were looking at it differently, right? We were looking at how much compute could we drive on AWS through selling pre-built software packages, which is a little different.
Yeah, yeah, and that's such a good point, Pete. Like, I mean, these days, pretty much there's a huge push to go towards usage based, and I truly believe usage based. Like, and I think and Jay Cripps, the CEO of Confluent, had said like usage based is the most ethical way of charging customers because it aligns with what value you provide to what value your customers are getting, and that's just like the right way of selling software or selling anything pretty much. um, so that aligns really well. Now, in terms of the AWS Marketplace itself, like since you were there in the early days, I'm sure it was like an iterative process where you tried something, things worked, thing didn't work, and then you worked on it some more. The marketplace didn't have like a metering service before. The and armies and SaaS until 2016 didn't have CPPOs until 2018. But even now, like we are in the deep trenches of it with AWS Marketplace, and things are like constantly evolving, changing, and being improved upon every single time. How does that, in your experience, impact the growth of the entire digital supply chain?
Yeah. So I think part of it is like a lot of those are hard problems to solve, right? Like we started where I remember them starting the narrative on CPPO in 2015, right? I
Mm,
remember the guy who came back and did most of the work and wrote it and then drove it through last year. Um, you have to remember Amazon has a certain way of billing, right? AWS around things running and feeding into a certain billing system. And then all of a sudden you started changing that where you have the marketplace and then you have to feed it in and make it work. So you're constantly dealing with two internal systems within AWS to then go have a customer or an ISV build something on top of it. And so the original stuff on the bottom had no concept of what we wanted to do with Marketplace or what Marketplace was building. And so making those changes are kind of hard. They take a while. Um, and then the market evolved too, right? Like selling SaaS as a subscription and those things that took a while for them to think about it. And the way that they had been doing things with the Omnis was completely different than how you would do that, right? Because you bill by users and you bill by versus there's a tag that says the hourly charge for software is another dollar. And so every hour that we bill for that instance of EC2, we add another dollar there, right? That was kind of the easiest way. And everything else was completely different. Um, and I think they looked at it. I think Dave McCann, who ran AWS Marketplace for a very long time, he was all about trying to understand what the market wanted, what customers wanted, and how do we build for that. And then how did he build in the interesting dynamics that he lived in, right, amongst all the other services that were growing super fast at AWS. So I think it's just catching up, and it's a lot of the things that we talked about back then have finally come to life. So I don't have privy to all the things they talk about now that'll come over the next 5 to 10 years, but I'm sure they're working through them.
Yeah, no, I mean, we work very closely with the AWS team. They're a fantastic group of people, very fast moving, and something that we really enjoy that partnership on our side because we are also a very fast moving company ourselves. Um, and so, Pete, as someone who has a significant experience in empowering specifically ISVs to sell through the marketplaces and digital first channels, someone who has been on the inside as well as outside, both at the same time for the past decade, what do you recommend as the first course of action when someone is evaluating whether cloud GTM strategy that's going to work for them or not?
So to be honest, the first course of action is having executive buy-in within the ISV.
Mm, mm,
Like you have to have leadership that's willing to kind of, well, at least there's data now. There used to not really be data. Um, that are going to believe in this and be patient with it, right? It's not. I always used to use it, and I still use it today. I used to tell ISVs when I was recruiting in the early days, this isn't. Do you remember the movie with Kevin Costner, Field of Dreams, where he builds the
Yep.
baseball field? Right. This
Yep.
isn't Field of Dreams. It's not like you build it and the buyers come and show up on day one. It's not like people are buying things on the retail Amazon third party platform. You're still going to have to drive customers here. Like
Mm.
right now, it's a great transaction alternative payment engine, right, for customers. It's not a discovery engine, and it's, or at least the vendors I've been a part of and worked with, we struggled with discovery and it being like a new source of business. Though I did used to get a lot of, in my last role, I had a regular flow. It wasn't huge of leads that we created because they saw our listing and were looking, to buy more different than we offered in our self-service listing. So it's not that there's sourced is impossible. It's just you have to set the perception of we're going to build this, we're going to use it to accelerate deals at the beginning,
Mm.
right? For the customers that ask for it, for the reps that ask for it. And then we sort of have to grow into, all right, how do we take and look at the rest of our pipeline and identify that it aligns to one of the major clouds that we work with, and
Mm.
then how do we bring them involved in it and leverage them to make those deals close faster?
Mm.
It's kind of the basic premise of it, but it's a process and it takes time.
And Pete, like as you mentioned, right, it takes time, and that's kind of what I have seen in my career as well. That's what we advise our customers as well when they're embarking on this journey. And I know there is no like silver bullet or a single answer to any one of it, but like if you were to, put a pin and say, hey, you as a leadership group, you must give X amount of time before you start questioning this channel, what would that be? Is it like 3 months, 2 quarters, a year? Like, where does that fall?
So part of it's going to be 10 where you are in your maturity as a company.
Mm.
Um, where are you at in your direct sales? One of the things that I did in my previous job on the outside was I built a bottoms up analysis, kind of using what I did in payments, right? So in
Mm.
the payments world, I used to go we were an alternative payment method, and I would go to some web e-commerce site and say, let me embed this button
Mm.
because we'll probably drive through 10 or 12 or 15%, right? There's some sort of cart share concept, right? And so if I was going into a new operation where they hadn't done marketplace and I was discussing, I'd probably say, like, let's set a goal of somewhere between 10 and 20% of the total revenue to drive that through this channel to get it going, right? Because that's sort of, we'll have enough customers there unless it's
Mm.
something, there's some other things that maybe go faster. But I think coming in and saying that we want to try to work towards a percentage of the overall business should go through it is probably a better way than saying it's going to be this net new thing over here, right? It's not a
Mm.
traditional channel partner. We're not going to go enable them. They don't have a sales force that's out selling that, and we're not paying them to sell, right? Marketplace fees are like credit card fees now, right? Channels like 10 times, not 10, 7 times more expensive, right? 6, 7, right? You pay a lot of money for them to go hunt. The marketplaces aren't hunters, right? They're accelerants. So it's a lot of that type of positioning at the beginning that if the rest of the organization understands that, then they're a little more patient with it. It's when they think it's just channel and they're like, oh, well, we're paying fees, so they should be driving all kinds of, no. That's not exactly what's happening here. So I think once you get that alignment done, the journey becomes easier for an alliance director or an alliance team.
Got it. And so that's actually a very good segue into my next question, which is having seen, as previously mentioned, like on both sides of the equation, then you come to GitLab, and then you launch your own route to market via the marketplaces. Walk us through that journey and how you actually came to the conclusion that this is a good channel, one, and two, how did you get that executive buy-in? How did you get the motion started and put them on the path to success?
Yeah, so when I first did it, it kind of came with I had this period of time where I got to, as a partner manager, marketplace was always part of my experiment. So I had 20 partners at one point. So I got to experiment and I always do the little puppet master thing. Like I got to play around and try different things. And then when I left to go to GitLab, I got to start with like my best practices.
Mm.
And where I really started, because we had gotten the listings done before I actually got there so that we'd have something to work with. The next part was finding some sales reps that were willing to experiment and try something different, because they didn't really have a core of reps that had been through this. This was in 2019. So Marketplace was just starting to accelerate, I think, then, right? The private offer flows, the SaaS contracts, is like a lot of the things. We weren't using CPPO then, but the real trick was finding some of the good reps to work with you that were
Mm.
seasoned, tenured, and then were respected throughout the organization. So I think when I got to GitLab, they had like 600 reps from enterprise down to long tail, like pretty big sales force at that point. And so for me, it was finding a handful of the enterprise reps that were well respected to roll the dice with me, to go through the not only just using Marketplace, but also using the AWS sales teams, right?
Mm.
There's three big marketplaces, and they each have a good each of the clouds has a good co-sell motion. They're all a little different. All I talk about is AWS because that's where my background is, right? But there's motions you can do with Google, and there's motions you can do with Microsoft. Um, the motions I did with, and they're all a little different. But with Amazon, getting to work with the field teams and figuring out how to engage with them it's not necessarily natural. There's not a huge, like, it's not like a channel partner sales rep where that person on the other side is going to make a nice commission check with you as the seller on the deal, right? The AWS reps, they get some quota relief, they get a little, but they're not getting a big check. It's not their primary focus. They're never going to make their number for the year just doing marketplace deals. And so getting some reps to work with them and to see value in it, for them to help them in some sort of way, and then to transact and feel like that made it easier, did huge wins for me internally, because then I could showcase them on QBRs internally.
Mm.
I could do internal win wires. We could start doing win wires with the cloud. And when I had those sellers who had been with us a while, and they were the people that were hitting club, the rest of the field starts to listen, right? Nobody wants to be the first, but everyone's a quick, fast follow. And so finding your champions internally that'll go out and experiment and do this, that are open-minded, was probably the best way that I had success early on. And then eventually it was, having enough people to map to our number of sellers we had on our team at some ratio, so that you could go to the obnoxious number of field people on the AWS side that you can never match up to, especially in the smaller ISVs in the startup world, right? But it all started with those initial reps, seeing value in doing it and getting value out of the other side.
And then how did you find these initial reps internally? Like what characteristics did you look for? Is there a process that can be repeated by other ISVs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing it today, right? I've been in my new role 2 months.
Mm.
They have a lot of it built out. My boss who did it had started it. So it's not like I'm starting from scratch this time. But honestly, I look at pipeline, try
Mm.
to figure out who might be an AWS customer. Sometimes it's easy as Googling a customer name in AWS to see if there's a press release. Or maybe try and it's hard to put things in the co-sell tools when you don't have any engagement yet, or maybe some of it, or your side's a little scared of sharing that information. But it's trying to identify who are the better reps in your organization, and then trying to figure out where there's some pipeline that you can identify as AWS, and then go try to bring them all together. Maybe go reach out through AWS to talk to the reps about what they know in an account, and then bring your team in, or go back to your team and then offer some of the things they offered, or just going to the rep. I think it's a little easier for me just to go directly to the rep and sell the value of working with AWS, just because I've been doing it forever. But if I was new to it, I might be playing the how do I go to one side and get a little bit of intel and then share it back with the other side, and try to get it so that there's enough trust to get them on a phone call and people will talk to each other. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to the trust factor, right? Everyone's a little guarded of their data and their information. But if you trust, once you build trust, then it's easier to share. So I sort of just bootstrapped it together like that, and grassroots efforts, and where can we do it? Sometimes the clouds offer some programs that help, some incentives to help get customers to use Marketplace, depending on your relationship with them. So sometimes dangling some of those incentives out. Sometimes it's finding stuck deals. Been doing that as well with some of the sales leaders, trying to identify where we have some things that feel stalled. Could we go get AWS if it's an AWS customer? We also saw an Azure Marketplace. So, if it's an Azure customer, right? Like, can we go get them to see if they can help us get this thing lit back up and going again, right? Maybe, maybe not. But when they're stuck, they're always open to ideas, right?
Mm, got
So
it. Got it.
unfortunately, it's not just some simple process or
Yeah.
some magical email I write. It's just kind of going out and a little bit of hand-to-hand combat, as I refer to it.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a great way to learn a company. It's a great way to get to know people, and for me to build my internal trust and value.
Yeah, and as always, like with every organization, like if you go out there, if you talk to people in one on one, and if you share your intentions, and people are generally nice and want to help out. So like I'm guessing if you spoke to, it's a classic sales conversion funnel, where if you talk to 10 people, one person might take that bet with you, and that one person is what you need. So it's kind of like this grassroots movement, so to call, that you go do with the sales reps.
Yeah, and then I have a philosophy. I like to kill people with kindness. So the ones that are hardest on me and back, I kill them more with kindness than they deserve, and eventually they come around. And sales reps are interesting people, and they have a hard job, and they put up with a lot of things, and so sometimes they are protective of the information they hold and the work they do, and they do things I don't like to do anymore. I did them in my early career, and that shows that wasn't what it was. So I have all the respect in the role, but you got to work through some of the things that the personalities that are in those roles.
Absolutely. And Pete, you spoke about there were about like 600 reps at GitLab when you got there. And is that right, or is that number
I think that's what the number was. It was somewhere in that neighborhood, but that
some
might have
large number?
included like the CS people and the SAs as well. But it was a very large number to
Got
me being the one AWS person at the beginning.
it. Got it. Okay. So like let's say a large number of field sellers, right? And when you initiated the marketplace motion, like you had reps doing enterprise deals, like 6 figure, 7 figure deals, and then perhaps some SMB deals like PLG motion and 5 figure deals as well, right? Now, in your experience, where did the motion of cloud marketplaces resonate the most with? Was it at the top tier, or was it sort of distributed across the board?
So most of my time I prioritized on the bigger deals, right? Like at GitLab, you could add a user and that would add one user to the lower tier product, and that was $228 a year.
Okay.
Right. So it takes a lot of $228 deals, or like, 10 users and it's $2,200, right? So we saw lots of small deals, and like you kind of have to do them because there's a path of least resistance for the customer, especially in smaller orgs where maybe they haven't tightened down the AWS buying process and the rights and who can do what. And so, I'm a practitioner in the DevOps world, where I was living with the engineering manager or a dev manager, right? And my rep could say, hey, I need to buy like $3,000 worth of GitLab, right? That's all they need today. And that's a great start. And maybe they'll grow, but those customers are just as important. Well, if I can take them through the marketplace and they can buy without having to go through procurement, finance, and all the other blockers corporate America has created to make buying hard, so that people don't waste money or don't buy unnecessarily, or there's some thought put into it, um, you could accelerate those deals. I still think there's a great move, and I still haven't seen someone do it. I've been pushing on every company I've worked at to do this, but your inside reps should be able to take a customer in a marketplace, dial in the number of users they want to buy, and buy it when it's a one call close, right? For those small deals. And they move on to the next one. They don't spend hours and hours processing paperwork and teaching their customer how to buy software, because that customer's never bought anything there, right? Or Now, when you get into the enterprise side, it's a little bit different because there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of stakeholders, right? And I think at the end, marketplace can be very helpful for lots of companies. One is, it's sometimes it's easier to go towards their commit. Just depends where the customer is in their journey and what they're doing. That's been a big incentive to help people burn down commits and hopefully take out bigger commits in the future. And the cloud providers love that motion, right? But I also think there's some things where you can ease the burden at a certain point on getting through the signature process, or if we could get more people to agree to the standard contracts thing that AWS put together, which is two of that. That's another iteration. They did enterprise contracts first, and they were very one-sided, and so no ISVs would use them. Standard contracts, everyone has a little bit of a grudge against them, but everybody kind of agrees on most of it. That could save everybody a lot of time if more people would move to, where the lawyers don't have to try to rewrite everything, right? Which just makes everyone's life difficult. So I think there's a lot of ways where the marketplace can help in those ways. And it creates interest from their sellers wanting to help you as well. So
And Pete, like a lot of the customers that we talk to, one of the concerns that we typically hear is, some of the customers or some of the companies that are just starting out on their sales motion, not just marketplaces, but sales motion overall. They're concerned about going out and in a multi-channel strategy where they have their direct channel, they have their marketplaces, perhaps they have PLG, and even maybe a channel. Um, while that is a valid concern, like I've seen GitLab doing a lot better across all of these channels, right? Now, so, and I know this is one of your favorite parts of the topic overall, but how did you ensure smooth operations for your teams and your peer teams within the organization when they were working with these multiple channels?
So I'm going to take a little chuckle at that because it may look smooth from the outside, but there was some knife fights going on the inside, right? I think the best way to solve for that, and this goes back to like leadership being bought in. You have to, and I'm actually going to take one of the things I loved at GitLab. They had one of the things Sid came out with. He said as part of kind of our values or principles was everybody can contribute, right? And where you can have struggles is when you have internal people all fighting over getting credit for a deal, right? Like only one person could source it, or only one person could be the partner, right? But yet the reality is when GitLab or any ISV goes out to sell, they need as many trusted advisors explaining the value to the customer that we bring to validate, right? So if I can have a sales team from their trusted cloud partner that they spend $1 gazillion with every year and their whole data center runs inside of them, right? There's a huge amount of trust there. And so when they're a fan of what you do and they're willing to get behind it, yeah, you want that. But the same thing happens with the SI partners and the resellers. I don't know the resellers as much, but if you're a consulting partner that's in there, if you're Accenture and you're in a big account, or a small and a mid to big account, right? Like, and you're building everything for them, or you're validating that they're doing the right thing, they trust you as well. So that's another group of folks that you definitely want in your camp. And so, the channel partners are the same way. And then you have internal teams you fight with, right? Did an SDR team, go out and source this lead versus the channel said they did it, or, the cloud team said they did it? So if you can create an environment where everybody can work together and everybody gets some credit and doesn't fight for it, then I think you get that what you're looking for, where everybody's on the same page. It's Owen's trying to do that much better, and like super excited about this year because I don't feel like I'm competing against the channel team or the other ISV teams or the other cloud teams, because they have a way where everyone who contributes can get credit, and so everyone can do well, and we can all help, and we can create more trust for our sellers to be successful. And I think that's really where you get things. And it's the old sales adage of comp plan dictates behavior.
Mm,
If you make it so everybody works well together, you'll get the behavior you want. If you got everybody fighting, it may look okay to the outside, but it's probably pretty bloody on the inside.
mm. Okay, Pete. So moving on to the next topic, the volume of transactions that that you ran through the cloud marketplaces on GitLab must have also brought a lot of benefits in terms of the relationships that you are building, loyalty you are building with the hyperscalers. How do you suggest an ISV that is starting their journey now with the hyperscalers build towards a co-sell, co-market, co-build kind of a motion, and how should they think about it? And what are some of the steps along the way?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, right? So I think one of the things, and I always go back and I put my partner manager hat on, even when I'm internal somewhere, or I'm talking to somebody about how to think about this. Um, you have two curves, right? You have your journey with the cloud provider, but you also have the curve that you're on as a company, right? If
Mm,
you're like a Series B or Series C startup, you're definitely in a different place than a company that just went through an IPO, right? Like different,
mm,
and so you have different amounts of resources. And so I always start with the basics. You need to crawl, and then you need to walk, and then you can run.
mm,
And one of the things that you need to do that in the marketplace journey is really to understand not trying to do all the clouds at once. I think that's actually something I see a lot of companies try to do. And I think they're
mm,
spreading themselves too thin because the clouds get a little demanding, right?
mm,
They want you to build this documentation. They want this. And there's a lot of, right? You're trying to build trust. And sometimes for them, the more hoops you'll jump through shows commitment. And if you're willing to do all the things and lean in, then they're always happy to help, right?
mm,
But if you don't do anything, then they're kind of like, okay, you can be a partner, but you're one of those partners. Um, so I think the first one is identifying who's the best one to start with for your business.
mm,
And, there's a couple things I think about there. One is which one are you using, right? Which one are you
mm,
a customer to? Because part of the whole partnering motion with a cloud provider for their perspective is the potential to help you grow, right? If I have a SaaS platform that runs on cloud A, and every time I add a new customer, that adds 2% to my billing each year, right? Because my platform grows. That's kind of one of the things they look at, right? Like, how am I helping you grow the platform? Because you'll grow your spend, in addition to solving customer problems, right? Which is, at least in the Amazon world, the core principle, the problem you're solving. And then I would say, and if I don't, maybe I have software that gets deployed, it's not SaaS, or I run on my SaaS platform across each cloud so that I have a unique story for each one. Uh,
mm,
where are my customers? Where do I predominantly see my customers running? Right? Because it doesn't make any
mm,
sense to do something where it doesn't align so well, right? And so you got to make sure you have the right partnerships there. Once you do that, then it's a matter of like, all right, what's the program path? Like, do I want to get a designation, right? Like, what's the Amazon used to be so much easier when they were tiered. I know the new one makes more sense. But if I get on my partner path or my software path, right?
mm,
Did I get through the hoops? Can I get to, my first big goal should be how do I get a competency, right, with Amazon? Because if you get a competency, you kind of put yourself a little bit above everybody else. You got
mm,
the SAs tore apart your technology, so the AWS sellers will feel like, hey, you built something that's good, and our guys validated it. And you shared with me a whole bunch of case studies, so we now know which customers are using it. And so if I'm an AWS seller and I'm going to go talk to my customer, and you hold a competency, they have a little more trust in your solution because they know some people tore through it.
mm,
While you're doing those things, I think building your marketplace presence and driving your current pipeline through it, what piece of it you will do,
mm,
back to that card share thing, um, I think is part of that initial path. Um, because I think you can do a lot through marketplace, but I think the cloud providers really like you to have the bigger relationship. They want to understand what are you doing to solve specific customer problems that are in niches that are either too small for them or they can't prioritize, right? Those are the best places to be as an ISV is when an
mm,
Amazon or a Google or Microsoft just it's just not really a big enough place for them to invest in. And you can build a great business. Amazon was never good at monitoring tools, right? Like the UIs and the interfaces. So it's left all that observability world. Like there's great primitives. It makes it easier for them to collect data and aggregate. But Amazon will never be the one building the coolest dashboards. That's just not in their DNA. And so all those tools will always probably do really well, and they'll, cannibalize one another, and they'll go through different phases of who's the best one in it. But I don't really see Amazon ever jumping in that forte. Like they're better just to collect the data and, make it easier for them to get the data and them run platforms. So I think it's not being so concerned they're going to cannibalize your business if you're doing the right things. But that's kind of the path I would take is, identifying a competency with the right cloud or the equivalent thing to an competency on the other clouds, to show that you're really good at one thing, even if you do 10 things. Pick something you're good at and like go after it. And don't fight the systems they have, of any of them, right? Like it's their game. If you play by their rules, it's not as frustrating. Um, yes, it doesn't always make sense to do it, but that's how they do it. And they're not going to change for anybody, not for you as an ISV. So I always kind of laugh when people are like, well, this isn't how it was done. And I'm like, doesn't matter. That's not who they are. You're on their field, so you have to play by their rules. So just embrace it and go with it. And I think you'll have a better experience. And if you can get your leadership to look at it that way, again, that's where your friction will come anyways. But that's, I think, where I would start if someone's going on a journey, and that's kind of the advice I normally give.
Got it. So like getting into programs, competencies, and getting certifications, different tiers, and that's kind of how you get
Right,
into it.
because once you've done that, then part of that with them is too, you got to start learning how to register deals, right? You need to learn how to go talk to the sellers at the cloud, right? They're not a buyer of your product. They're never going to buy it, and they're never going to resell it, right? But they need to understand what problems you solve, right? They need to understand where you fit and why customers would need you versus like, here's all the really cool features we do, right? They don't know all the services they have. So you kind of have to, and that's a learning process, like on how you work and do enablement, right? And when you start doing these things, then the co-marketing stuff starts to show up, and some of the co-sell stuff starts to show up a little bit more, right? You go and you do a sponsorship, you maybe pick a summit, or you get an immersion day on the ADA. But those take a little time. You can't just jump into a million and one things. You kind of have to learn how they operate so that you can see how you'll plug into it a little bit better. And as you get better at things, other doors open when you lean in, but you're also will start seeing a return on it, right? The first time you get AWS or a cloud provider to like help you unstick a deal or make it close faster, or they do just one little thing that brings in a big deal, that it changes internal opinion very quickly, especially in sales leadership, right? Um, you know, things like just understanding how the customer buys and the games they play in procurement. Like I've had that be like just an eye-opening experience for a really big deal that we were in the middle of a dead zone, right? And the rep had warned us. He's like, they'll go quiet on you for 2 weeks just to see what you do. They do it to everyone, right? And usually what will happen is a sales rep will panic in 2 weeks, come back with a discounted price. But my rep knew to hold his guns because that was the process. He had validated it. And with confidence, he could share that up his management chain, and then it all worked out, right? The worst is when they don't know. And leadership, they get that very quickly, whether the reps want to ever agree to it, right?
Yeah.
And they'll know that deal could be at risk. But when you come confidently with real data points, they're like, oh, okay, this is what I'm paying you, right? That's what I'm looking for in my sellers. So there's lots of value you can extract from them. It's not always super easy to measure, but sometimes it's anecdotal like that. But that comes as you get going. You can't do that on day one or day three. You kind of
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
build towards that.
Absolutely. And Pete, you reminded me of this one story. We have one of our customers who were not really initially as sold on the marketplaces. They almost reluctantly, started going on marketplaces. But like now, 1 year after that, they are so sold. Their entire sales leadership is so aligned that they are actually moving 100% to marketplaces only, because they're seeing, like, the fees are better, the benefits are much better, it's a lot more easier, your deals get bigger as a result. So like there's literally no reason that their sales leader was like, I have no reason why I would take any deal outside of marketplaces at this point in time. So they're going all in.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, you still run into, I mean, it used to be different when the fees were higher. Like it was hard sometimes, and
Yep.
right, or when like those channel costs, those things get passed on to the reps. And I mean, that's actually another thing that as you do this, finding a way to be comp neutral while you build the business, right? You are reducing some fees, right? When you don't have to send invoices, process invoicing, right? Like if you're telling me that a company's doing that for much less than 3% internally, like for direct deals, I want to see, I want the CFO to prove that to me, because I don't really think internally they're doing it. It's not free, right? Now, when they were 8 and 13 and 20%, and those CFOs are making those things, yeah, I totally got it, right? Because then they're like, well, why aren't they sourcing the business, right? That's what I pay to a channel partner to source the deal. Um, and so I think now that they've brought the fees down to commodity type pricing, like credit card pricing, I think that was the right way for them to be able to have us scale it. Like it was hard to justify some of the higher fees.
Absolutely. And we are seeing the same thing on our side as well. Like when AWS specifically reduces fees starting December, and that has caused this like huge influx of interest on marketplace overall from small, big, all kinds of enterprises for sure.
Yeah, I think that's definitely helped. I think that was smart of them to finally get in line with the rest of the market.
Yeah, exactly. So that could be one of the factor for acceleration. But Pete, I wanted to pick your brain on how fast you think the market will accelerate, because today anywhere around 13% of all SaaS tools get purchased via either reseller or hyperscaler marketplaces. How fast do you think the market is evolving, and where do you see partnerships influencing this, and where do you think we'll land eventually from that 13% number? Let's say in the next 5 to 10 years.
So I think it's dependent on a couple things. It'll be interesting to see how the hyperscalers continue
Mm.
to want to create a value for the customer, right? Right now with the burn down of commit, right? You choose the one you're on, and it's like I use the analogy a lot of like the rewards credit cards you have in your wallet, right? I have a Delta American Express card, and I have a Alaska because I live in Seattle, right? My other airline, whatever their Visa card is, right? And I'm paying with the one that's giving me some sort of value prop that I want. As the merchant who's taking my credit card, I just want you to buy something, right? um, but Delta and Alaska are incentivizing me to pick theirs, right? They're giving me things and other things. And so I think depending on the hyperscalers appetite to continue those incentives for customers is going to have a lot to do with it. Hopefully they're also going to make procurement that much easier. The customers maybe at some point are like, all right, well, it's just easier than us processing deals like the customer of yours that you were telling me about that, it's going all in. The other part is how the evolution, if you're including resellers in there, and how things like CPPO and how they work on the other clouds, which some of them are going to have problems with because their marketplaces aren't set up as true marketplaces. They're almost set up like resellers and distributors, and you can't do three-legged payments and four-legged payments unless you're a true marketplace. Like you can't be seller of record. Like this is what I learned in the payments world, right? Amazon had a lot of experience in marketplaces when they launched it, so I think they made some right choices,
Mm.
which makes their world a little easier. The other one I have that I see, and I've learned a little bit about this being at own because our typical customer isn't an AWS customer,
Mm.
right? Like who buys inside an organization. It's more a line of business and things related to that. And it's almost like the AWS field team, if they want to help me sell into those accounts or the Microsoft or the Google accounts, um, they need to have relationships outside of IT. Because when you get outside, sometimes they don't understand that AWS or the marketplace, or they use the cloud. Our stuff aligns a lot to Salesforce today and some other big SaaS platforms. And so, making sure that you can align with the right people, right? Co-sell, it's hard to do co-sell when there's no common people that we both need to work with. And,
Absolutely.
and so I think it'll grow. I bet it doubles over the next 3 to 5 years to 25, 30%.
Mm.
Um, and going with my alternate payment theories, that probably seems right that it'll end up 25 to 30% of
Mm.
transactions will go that way. And there's a lot of companies. I was on with a regulated industry last week, and they've got some very strict process in procurement, right, where they like to see all the invoicing with the same names across it, right? The purchase order thing. And if all of a sudden your invoice is coming from AWS, but your deal is with these, like it just breaks their processes today. Um,
Yeah.
and so it'll be interesting to see how some of that evolves, right? Like, are those companies going to think about changing procurement methods, right? Does that, because we still have to deal with how big companies want to buy, right? They still like to be in control of that and dictate it. Um, so I think actually those are the ones that are most ripe for the disruption for AWS Marketplace or the other marketplaces. But they may be hard because those are big companies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've also started seeing, Pete, is some of these companies, not the big, massive behemoths, I think they're still to jump on the procurement bandwagon just yet, but some of the upper, like very upper mid-market companies have started, they're aligning their procurement teams to procure via the marketplaces, especially the ones that have committed spend across all three and they are big enough to have a commit across all three. So that could be a foreshadow of what we are about to see in the market in the next 5 to 10 years for sure.
Do you see a lot that are running all three? I see mostly people are picking two.
I see a decent amount that see, like, the number of companies that pick one is the highest, I would say, but there's a good chunk that are doing across all three. That's because now you need to be everywhere where your customers are, and customers tend to choose different hyperscalers for different needs. So if you want to sell something, then you have to be on all three, and then if you're going to be on all three, you might as well have a commit with all three. I see different commit sizes though, like there's, you could easily tell that there's a primary hyperscaler and then there's the other two secondary. So I see that distribution, but I definitely see across all three.
I think the other part when I think about that number growing too is the cloud providers have to be a little bit flexible about where your software
Hmm.
runs.
Hmm.
It's really hard to do multi-cloud. And if you are a small to mid-size ISV, and you're running your product on one, it's not really easy to run it on two or yank part of the workload over onto one of the other ones because that's always a challenge where you know it's part of that how they want to like help. And I remember with AWS when they launched it, that was Andy Jassy's belief that was how he's going to get all these SaaS platforms to move to AWS. Um, but you hit a certain point as an ISV where it's too hard to move. There's too much opportunity cost to like re-platform just so I can sell through a marketplace. So it'll be interesting to see how they manage that as well. Because I think that will become the crux when somebody says, I want to buy through Cloud C because that's my primary cloud, but as an ISV, I run on Cloud B, and Cloud C says I have to run on you to sell through, right? Like at some point, it's going to come back to the cloud providers. I'm trying not to pick names because I know they all have the
I know.
same belief system there, right? So it makes it hard as a smaller ISV. You can't appease all the hyperscalers at once. Um, so it's good you are seeing some that have all three because that definitely helps some of the vendors that haven't figured out how to make their product run across all three natively to make
Yeah.
them all happy.
Yeah, and now with K8s and some of the technology that exists out there, you could easily, in theory at least, replicate your software across all three with minimal effort. All right, Pete, we are almost towards the end. Thank you so much for your time. Before we leave, Pete, any parting thoughts for our audience and listeners that something that I might should have asked but haven't that you would like to share?
I think the other thing we didn't get to talk about today that's one that it's like a second level problem or a third level problem. It's how do you figure out how to bring the marketplace transactions into your back office?
Mm,
Um, when I did payments at Amazon, big part of what we architected was how do you inject things into the accounting systems, the fulfillment systems, right? It was you took the order and you process it, the charge went through, now how do you fulfill it, right? And I feel like with software, because it's not so necessarily non-touched, and I've seen it at a lot of places, and I talked to a lot of my peers about it, um, is once we get that order and it's complete, right? How do we make that as part of the flow into the booking process? How do you think about it? How to do fulfillment and then the renewals and the ups and the ads. And what I found it's not the easiest thing. And what I found is a lot of companies ended up, yeah, you can go launch that marketplace listing. Sure. Go ahead. Whatever. We can't help you. And then fast forward 3-4 years and you're doing a few hundred transactions, right? And that could be a few million to a lot of millions of dollars, right? Depending on size. Like if you watch the curve on some of the growth, getting up to 10% of your growth, 10% of your revenue or 20% of your revenue, and then your revenue grows over 3-4 years, right? Well, all of a sudden your back office hits a bandwidth problem,
mm,
right? They're trying to figure out how to reconcile 500 transactions, right? And they're not really staffed, and they never, because they didn't care, they didn't believe in it. I think it's changing for newer vendors starting now because they're hearing about it. But I've watched it happen at a couple places where all of a sudden it's this huge wrench gets thrown in the back office process because they didn't really want to plan for it at the beginning. They didn't really believe it was actually going to work. And then it does. And because the alliance people said it was, and they went and did the work to make it work, right? And now they're looking, they're like, well, wait, what's, and I think it's a bigger problem that doesn't get talked about in general. But I think it's super important for your finance and your deal desk teams to be in to get on board early. Like they don't have to build everything early, but they got to understand it early, and they have to put it into their roadmaps of the things that they're gonna build over the next 2 to 3 years, because it's gonna take you that time to get probably to a big number, unless you're one of these like unicorn startups that goes from 0 to gazillion overnight, because there's been a few lately. But you need to be able to deal with it because booking becomes, and collecting the money is important to the business, right? It's not just the transaction. And so that's a topic I'd like to hear more people talk about sometimes. It's kind of boring and it's kind of ugly, but it's so important to the long-term health of using payment systems like this and making it a part of it. I'd love to see the cloud providers give us better connectivity coming out, where there was a feed that fed into the top, subscription services, or put it in so that it could be more ingested, more automation be put into place. And I just feel like it's a missing, it's sort of that topic that's off in the corner nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah, Pete, that's such a good point, and in fact, like it's a topic that's very close to my heart as well, which is also the reason why we started Klazar. This like whole like forecasting pieces to it, the whole like sales ops automation, deal strategy, deal desk, all of it. I feel like I could talk with you for another hour just on that topic, but maybe we save that for our next podcast. And Pete, thank you so much for coming on the Klazar podcast again. It was wonderful having you, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our listeners.
Yes, thank you for having me. I had a great time today.
Thank you. Have a good one.
We'll talk soon.